We're
Oh,
live.
all right, we're live. Well, welcome to whoever is on with us and on this special occasion of DJ and Jake's first live stream ever as part of Reframing the Narrative. This will eventually become episode 36, but we are coming at this with a few ideas to kind of guide the conversation. We'd love to see some comments from whoever is with us here live and certainly be part of the conversation as well. But Jake and I had talked about this before. Jake did all the hard work to set up this live stream, and we've got a few topics in mind, but we'd love for, as I said, people to chime in here and give us your thoughts and recollections of 9/11. So I'll just start off by saying that this conversation won't necessarily be a detailed deep dive into all the evidences of why the 9/11 narrative is bogus and why we should think otherwise. But we will dive into that a little bit. But I think as a bigger picture discussion, we want to focus on why it still matters, and we'll definitely get to that part of the conversation. But before we lift off, and you'll notice the shirt here that I'm wearing is very intentional because many of these things relate. But Jake, good to see you, and thanks for setting up this live stream. I know I'm excited. I hope everyone else viewing it is as well.
Good to see you, PJ. And it's definitely exciting to know that we're live, even if just my mom is watching. I did invite my mom, so hi, mom. I don't know if she's watching, um, but one of these days she will. And it's kind of a different feeling to feel like you're on the air, and it takes me back to being a college DJ, back when I knew that there are probably more cows than humans listening, given the location of the college I went to back in Ben and Jerry's country. Yeah, not Brooklyn, actually. Yeah, Vermont. So, yeah, it's just cool to be here. It's an unfortunate anniversary, 24th anniversary of 9/11, and like many landmark events, real, imagined, staged, lie hop, let it happen on purpose, made it happen on purpose. Whatever the case of the event, it was a phenomenon that reached our consciousness, that affected us in so many different ways. And we saw it play out in both narratives and things like legislation, like concrete ways, tangible ways, legislation, justification for invasions, and um, going back to what George W. Bush said, they hate us for our freedoms. And then what did they do? They tried to take away our freedoms. So yeah, they do hate us for our freedoms. We can get into that part. So I thought we'd start by kind of going back to 9/11 and just our recollections of maybe the evolution of our consciousness as far as our understanding and perception of that event, and how that has changed. Yeah, so I used the word evolution. Sorry, not it wasn't created.
I was going to
Um,
bust you on that, so
I
thanks for
know.
acknowledging it.
Yeah. Well, everything calls for a nice glass of
Oh, pour that discernment. We're going to need it.
discernment.
We're going to need that for
Yeah,
this conversation. And
exactly.
yeah, I'll just start the conversation about my recollection of 9/11. And I've told this story, I think, in one of our past episodes, but also maybe in one of my Central Texas rabbit hole videos that I'll apologize to the few subscribers that I do have for letting that lag. I do intend to get back to it. But that being said, I think about 9/11 and everything leading up to it. And as many people viewing our shows will recognize, is that there's always some form of predictive programming leading up to some major political event like 9/11. And I can remember being in the movie theater somewhere in my early 20s and seeing a bunch of wartime propaganda before the big shoe dropped. And I remember thinking to myself at that time, what are they preparing us for? Which was an odd thought for someone who was young and naive as I was, but it sort of planted a seed of skepticism for what I didn't know was going to happen. And that Tuesday morning of 9/11 in 2001, I turned on the TV in shock as everyone else did, and was traumatized mentally as most people were. And once that shock had worn off, that same thought that I had came back around, where I had this realization, wait, I feel like I knew something was coming. And that personally led me to looking into the details, and having what I consider my first awakening of really seeing the world as it is, or at least starting to look behind the curtain. Certainly there was a lot to learn, and continue to learn even to this day. But I can say that 9/11 really shook me awake in a way that I didn't expect, and started to turn me into that nutter who would talk about things like 9/11 and other conspiracies at parties, and become the tinfoil hat guy. But that being said, we've seen a lot of acts along the way that have shook people awake, and I think we'll get into that. But Jake, maybe just give us a quick view of what 9/11 looked like for you, and how it changed you.
Well, I happened to be in New York State, not the city, on that day, and was hanging out. I was trying to do a little work for a client in another continent, and for some reason, well, we were planning a trip that day. I won't go through the entire story, but this is kind of important. So we were going to fly actually that day, and we needed to keep everything light because we were going on a small aircraft. And so I had my little suitcase all pretty much packed except what I needed for my work. And I normally was in the habit of staying up really late at night when I went back to New York to visit. But that particular day, I got up really early to try and do some work because we were going to leave. And I just happened to get in the habit of listening to the radio that was sitting on the desk, that what I was using a workstation, and listened to Don Imus in the morning. I don't even know if is still alive or whatever happened to the show, but it's kind of like the earlier version of Howard Stern without the real retardation. And that's where I heard, a plane has hit the towers, there's smoke, um, all that kind of stuff. The first chatter, basically, that something had happened in New York City. And so, of course, I went, and I think this is the case with a lot of people. I went and turned on the television, and then the second event happened with the second tower. And yeah, that was the initial where I was and when it happened. But and then we were grounded, so we weren't able to fly the rest for our trip, our planned trip, and we ended up driving quite a ways and then taking a ferry to get where we were going. Um, but at any rate, my initial reaction was kind of a PTSD reaction, and I needed like 3 weeks to kind of get my senses back a little bit. And since I have a foreign language expertise, the conversation with my dad, who's he was always kind of a fan in a way, or like I say, a lay expert in kind of like intelligence and that sort of thing, and military. He was involved in aviation related things. So we were talking about, well, maybe they need people with an expertise in my language skills at the NSA. So this is my initial reaction, is like, go get them, just uh, USA, USA, they hate us. 19 hijackers. Yeah, it was them. Passports found in the rubble. It was them. And it took a while to just kind of come down from what they were feeding me. And like I said, it took like 3 weeks to really regain my bearings, because I was really heavily impacted, no pun intended, by what I saw on the television. I can't say what happened, what I saw on the television. And so I did want to talk, and I'll stop here, but I did want to get into like the evolution of like, how did I go from almost willing to submit my resume and sign up for and trying to apply for a job in intelligence at the NSA, and also move back to America because I wasn't living in America at the time, to where I eventually came, and then how that consciousness also impacted. This is something we talk a lot in our conversations about, is how did that awareness and consciousness and shift in that energy and consciousness affect my behavior and decisions in years hence, for instance, when 2020 rolled around. So back to you on that.
Yeah, well, and I can't pretend that all the realizations came to me at once after that event. I think it was little pieces at a time, and it sounds like that's what happened for you. But I think for most people who did get shaken awake, it was some form of realization that the world was not as it seems, and it's much like the the Matrix presents, that you have that moment, you see something that doesn't quite fit, a glitch in the Matrix, or what have you. And I feel like that was just a starting point for a lot of people. And that was just, it, from there, people's progress in seeing the world more clearly can and did take many forms. And for me, I thought it was just one more incident along the way, and things that we've seen, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit more, but one more event to kind of shepherd people towards the quote unquote new world order, right? And you touched on how the end result, besides war profiteering, and all wars are banker wars, was the removal of freedoms, and the by and large the public's acquiescence to more surveillance and more security measures. Before that, I remember a time when you could go to the airport and you could see your loved one onto their plane, and the most you had to go through was a metal detector. But you could carry your water through the metal detector, you could go hang out, like things were so much more loose. And you look at today, and they freak out about basically anything, more than 3 ounces, and it's somehow a security threat. So that's the world we live in now, but most people just accepted it. And so mission accomplished. And fast forward to 2020, as you mentioned, look at all the additional surveillance and tyranny that most people accepted gladly and pushed for. Yes, exactly. Don't hate us for our freedoms. And that was just one more stage of it. But one thought I had coming into this live stream, and why I chose to wear this shirt in particular, is 9/11 would have never been possible without the moon landing. I feel like the moon landing was stage one of testing the public's, I don't want to say gullibility, but maybe the public's discernment. And very appropriate that you did pour a big glass there, because always needed in anything that we turn on and see on the TV. I'll even take it a step further, and we can dive into this perhaps later in the conversation. But the whole situation with the so-called assassination yesterday, I can't say whether it did or didn't happen, but there's already people pointing out anomalies in the video. And I just think things progressed from the moon landing, which was clearly, anyone who looks into that will see that it was staged. But most of the public accepted it, and accepted that we needed to invest in NASA and everything related to that. And there's obviously far-ranging implications for believing in space and all of that. But that being said, it's it's just one more play on the grand stage. And 9/11 certainly set up a number of agendas, as did 2020, and everything that has and will happen going forward. So that's really just my reaction to your introduction there, that I think that there's broad ranging impacts to our lives beyond just seeing something that shocked us on TV.
Yeah, so many. There's on so many levels, like just your emotional reaction, how you accept certain policies, maybe even like your viewing habits on TV, or things like just feeling like you're not secure anymore. Just thinking back to like this stupid color terror alerts, things like that, really trying to scare everyone like there's a boogeyman under the bed. And so you're not safe in your own home. They're out to get us, and they could come at any time. If you see something, say something. And it's just obvious that whoever they are didn't want people feeling secure, and they wanted people to clamor for a solution. And like you said, a big part of that is the whole like cameras everywhere part, the security state. And that was being planned well in advance. In fact, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but there's a certain shitty little country in the Middle East, short SLC for short, that retold its entire economy and education system in the way, they're almost a pioneer of the whole startup thing, and incubating startups with money that and resources that came directly from intelligence. And Satan Yahoo himself, now you know who the shitty little country is, right? Um, Made it a point before 9/11 to say, we are retooling our economy, and basically we will own cyberspace was one part of that, and the whole idea of security. And so one way to justify that is always to say that you're under attack, you have to do these things. And now we're even seeing, getting way ahead, but in response to something like what went on in the last couple days, last 24 hours. Oh, can you turn up Jake's audio? All right. I will do that.
And while he's making that adjustment, thanks for the comments and everyone who's with us. But one thing I wanted to jump in there really quickly to just link the what happened in 9/11 to 2020 is fear is the ultimate weapon, right? And it's always the case that war is justified by the fear of some other foreign invader or what they might be doing to supposedly threaten our freedoms. And so really, I mean, looking at the public's reaction on 9/11 and past that, and their like I said, acquiescence to all this surveillance, the powers that be, whoever those folks are, were like, well, let's run the next big one in 2020, and fear has to be our main vehicle for getting what we want. And certainly you saw that. I mean, you look at so many people you'd walk by on the streets all masked up and shirking away from people walking by them. You could see the fear in their eyes. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not just agendas, it's that controlling the space between people's ears and keeping them in a constant state of fear.
Yeah, people literally crossing the street to avoid passing you in close quarters on the sidewalk. Is that better, Brady? Or should I just get closer to my beautiful microphone? Yeah, that's fear is the main thing, and fear overrides our rational thought and our faculties for analyzing things. And I think I must have been overcome by fear. I was definitely a bit paralyzed by my initial reaction, and then the other reaction is we got to do something, right? So here's the problem reaction solution. And most of the time we search for an external solution to something that we perceive as a problem, or some problem that's been handed to us and sold to us and propagandized to us. So it helps to take a step back and say, wait a minute, what are we doing here? And going back to the evolution of my perception of
5 minutes in the
9/11.
sin bin for evolution.
Oh, yeah, but this is where it is relevant, because I'm not talking about monkeys and and dinos. But thanks. I'll take that time later at the end of the show. So, how do you get from I'm in a passive state and I'm worked up and do something to wait a minute, this isn't what I thought it was. And for me, there's many things, and it wasn't even like, okay, I saw the buildings turn to dust before they even hit the ground, or any of the thousands of anomalies that we will probably get into a little later. But just what is the justification for going to war with Iraq on Purim, March 20th, 2003, and just it, despite all the even the official narrative never pointing anything at Iraq. So Iraq and maybe Afghanistan, you could see that if 19 hijackers left their caves and left their laptops in that cave and then flew out, you could maybe see that justification. But Iraq, and that they were just dead set on reshaping the Middle East. Oh, okay. That's when I really started to look into stuff.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I remembered one of the famous lines from one of GW's speeches afterwards, where he said, "You're either with us or against us." And what a way to get people united to the New World Order agenda. There was no middle ground of, well, you may want to see some sort of resolution, or you may want to see justice served in some way, but you question what you're being told. There was no middle ground, right? And so it was a very polarizing thing. You were either for the invasion and for the bombing of innocent people, or you were on their side. And I feel like that act has been repeated over and over. Even if you recall, once the armed darts were rolled out and people who wanted to get back to normal were required to prove that they had complied, and it was once again, you're either with the agenda or one of these dangerous people to be suspicious of and to avoid. And so I think that's a really important aspect to all this, is the polarization of views from these narratives that are pushed down our throats. I mean, you couldn't turn on the TV or the radio or anything around that time and not hear something related to 9/11, just as in 2020 it was everywhere you looked. And even if you were driving down the street, you would see these testing clinics, and you go into your Walgreens and see all these different test kits. And I mean, it was just in your face, right? And there really was no alternative.
And all the body bags everywhere in the refrigeration trucks full of dead bodies. You don't forget that. That was really important, right?
Yeah, and the people dropping in the streets in Beijing.
Face planting in the street.
Totally believable. Totally believable. Yeah, but yeah, no, it's there's so many aspects of this, and I think that's what we're trying to
Polarization.
communicate here in this live stream is, even though it was an event more than 20 or close, yeah, more than 20 years ago, it still has impacts on our lives, and we can spot patterns in what's pushed to us in mainstream media and events in the world. And like I said, I brought up the big incident with Charlie Kirk yesterday, that you know at least from what we're shown in videos, there was a gruesome live execution. Whether or not that happened remains to be seen, but it was, again, this trauma-based thing that is pushing agendas and quite possibly trying to get the left versus the right paradigm fired up again. But ultimately, I think it's another act of polarization, and we just have to be able to look at what's happened in our world and really pick out the patterns so that we don't fall for them, and we have a full glass of discernment like you do there, Jake.
Yeah. You hit on the key thing is in every one of these events that reaches our consciousness, the between the lines we can read the intent to divide us and polarize us, which is the same thing. Tautology, I love it. And we're seeing, first of all, we're I would say incentivized to put ourselves in our own camps to begin with, and then they go and they hit the little whatever it is that sets you off. And it could be in the traditional, and at least in the last 60 years or so, as far as the left-right divide. And I would say this might even go beyond America's borders to anywhere else in the English-speaking world, where abortion would be one of these push-button trigger issues, right? If you're on the liberal side, that's like a sacrament to you. If you're on a conservative side, that's like the line that you can't cross. And no way I could ever go over the liberal side because I believe in I'm pro-life, right? And so you can see that that's associated with a certain viewpoint or position, and then that gets pressed and it gets activated by whatever it is that's going on. So it was really obvious, the way that this Charlie Kirk situation has started to play out already, that it's a dangerous situation with the potential for a greater to widen the divide and even end up in kind of hot conflicts between people that identify with left, right, and then there's of course the pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, evangelical, Muslim, whatever. Pick your divide. You know, we have been as a general populace just so polarized over the years, and it's since the advent of that Talmud vision. But I love to remind myself. I was just thinking of this yesterday when I was living in Asia, and they were at the beginning stages of democracy, where they had the first direct presidential elections, and then they had the first direct elections of the mayors of the biggest cities. The media was going crazy telling everybody how divided they were and really provoking that division. Well, I was working in an office environment with a lot of people who were of one demographic or the other, and that division was invisible in the office. And that was just an observation. This is a good lesson in what the media always trying to stir up, because the media, if it serves the masters, the paymasters who own it and run it, they're always going to keep a divided populace. It's just easier to manage. It's a management problem. It's it's a McKinsey nut to crack, right? McKinsey comes in and says fire people. It's much more efficient. Well, McKinsey comes into the government situation and says divide people. They're distracted. They're divided. They'll fight amongst themselves, and they'll never notice that you're the puppet master behind the curtain.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep people fighting each other and they don't fight the powers that be. Yeah, it's a classic playbook, but I want to take this. Yeah, absolutely. People are traumatized by what they see on TV, including the events of 9/11. And I would just say that I want to take this conversation to a slightly different angle. And I would also say we are going to touch on some of the evidences that the narrative just doesn't make sense. So we'd love to see some comments from those of you who are with us about your favorite evidences or your favorite videos related to this subject. I always love hearing a different perspective, so I'll just encourage people to type in their votes now. But I want to harken back to last week when we were talking about what is real, because I think it's really important both for 9/11 and what happened yesterday. So there's, I would say, sufficient evidence that perhaps a plane or planes didn't hit the towers and there was some other form of destruction present. And certainly you can find those videos where people show the slow motion of the plane supposedly entering the building and how it doesn't follow any of the known laws of physics as it's doing that, and there is the potential of it having been a TV illusion, right? However, there are people who will come forward and say, no, I saw the plane. And I just wonder, when we talk about what's real, there's this aspect of illusion and like mass hypnosis almost. And I wonder, is the power of suggestion enough to tell people that whatever may have flown by, if that was a real thing, um, that was the plane? And I wonder too, is there some spell casting going on with a lot of this? And same thing with the event yesterday. How do we know that was real? And even if there were people on campus, how, what did they actually see? And so I'm just opening the discussion to what's real in all these events. And I've heard some compelling arguments that maybe there were planes and they link up to the Judy Wood set of explanations, but I've also seen really compelling evidence that maybe it was all just an illusion on TV. So, this is another aspect to it, is there's this mass hypnosis going on through the various media where we get our information, and you really have to question what you're seeing or what you're being fed, how real it is, and what the agenda behind it would be.
Yeah, but and not to be too flippant or anything, but does it really matter if it was real in a way? It's a it's a justification for something, and whether there are planes or not, that is what they ran with, and then it was used as it could be a magician's sleight of hand, right? The planes hit, therefore the buildings had to collapse, and that makes sense on a intuitive level until you really start thinking about it, right? It's just, yeah, there were collisions, fires, things disintegrated. That made sense a little bit, right? And then you get to building 7. um, 2 planes, 3 towers. Wow, 2 planes, 3 collapses. But I think getting back to like how Charlie Kirk, what people experienced, and like what Donna says, uh, people were traumatized by yesterday's event. I've seen that with people that are very close to me in my life. I'm seeing a traumatization uh, take place, transpiring as I'm living my life. Someone close to me, and so in a way, we're almost, in getting back to our discussion, our most recent episode, we're in a post-truth phase now, where people will just endlessly argue about minutia, and there are people that might sleuth out anomalies in video, and there's AI filters and or detectors and things that people will point to. But what really matters is that it's a justification for it. It is a traumatizing event. I mean, even seeing like a horror film, that actor didn't die unless it was like Brandon Lee. And if you see blood spurting out of them, that could be traumatizing, right? So what we saw, if we've viewed those videos, is something that affects us in certain ways, and that could manifest in various behaviors. It could manifest, like I said before, it could end up to legislation. I think what we might see is the people that identified as MAGA or the right, which MAGA was losing. They were losing some of their base due to the Epstein malarkey, like the refusal to come clean on that and go forward with that. And of course, what do you expect? It's government. They're a bunch of scumbags. But interestingly, Charlie Kirk was absent from that whole charade where they handed out those dossiers. We got the Trump the Epstein files. Interestingly enough, he was absent from that. So anyway, what my point is, it almost doesn't matter if we keep everything online, and we're just doing our own research online, and we're doing our discussion online. We're in an ersatz environment, but the emotions are real, and how we give our consent and pay our attention to various things is real as well.
Yeah, I mean, really good point. But I do think it's important to understand the truth, because anything outside of the truth is probably a distraction or leading you to some other conclusion that may not be where mentally or spiritually you want to be. And I just think too about, I've brought this up before, and we talked about it with Medicine Girl a few weeks back. But some of these people that we were meant to find as we were getting awakened or reawakening, whatever the case may have been. Richard Gage is an example of someone who has a lot of popularity based on 9/11 research and his activism. But there's many out there who have worked with him directly or knew him in some way who question some aspects of his character. And I'm not here to throw dirt on him. I don't know him personally, but he was very visible, whereas there are other people who've done more in-depth research, have definitely run into his crosshairs. There's sort of his established viewpoint of 9/11, and it syncs up in a weird way with the official narrative. And again, I just wonder, some of these personalities we're fed and we find easily, is that really just making sure that the opposition is well controlled and that narrative is streamlined? And so I think there's a lot of aspects to this. And certainly I'm a big fan of Dr. Judy Wood. That's no secret. I've mentioned that on our podcast before, that I think she's done some really great work to point towards some sort of directed energy that was the real source of what happened. And, to your point about does it matter or not, on some level, no. I mean, the impacts are real, but on another level, it does, because if there's this level of energy weapon that was available in 2001, we have no idea how that's developed or how long that's been around. And that's something that we should understand, and not necessarily to be living in fear, but just, what are the three-letter agencies and the powers that be hiding behind, or what do they have up their sleeve? What is available as a method of control of the populace? And I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, that is a very important point in getting to the, I'm not going to use the word evolution, the progress, not Canadian today, or the advancement of various technologies that would be available to intelligence, military, government, well in advance of their popularization or giving them to us to use. For instance, my dad was on the intranet, right, in the 60s. And that exists. It was developed by DARPA, right? So if you get to yesterday's events, 9, 10, 25, Charlie Kirk, and perhaps some kind of fakery, and I'm not going to assert that at this moment, but I am entertaining those notions. But again, my position is that it was an event. So maybe they learned, maybe that kind of fakery was available, and AI type machine manipulation and learning was available in advance of 2001, and that was used at that point. And there's been a lot of learning, and there's been a steep curve of advancement ever since, as far as fakery, as far as using the media, how, and then covering all those bases, like you said, being able to find Richard Gage, being able to find David Ray Griffin, even allowing websites like, I don't even remember what it was, but John Gold was the guy, right? 911truth.com or something like that. Early days, Eric Huffschmidt was a big one. You might have never heard that name. A lot of people might never heard the name Eric Huffschmidt. He turned out to be not really implying guilt by association here, but he was like a relative by marriage to Rupert Murdoch. And when people started figuring out a few things about his past, he basically he attacked and then he disappeared. So there's all sorts of people that are there. It's kind of like a pinball machine. You ping into one thing and you go into the next. All those little pillars are set up in advance for you to smack up against, so you don't make it to through that whole maze of those pillars.
Yeah, great point. And then who's the most famous person to popularize the saying that 9/11 was an inside job? Alex Jones,
9/11
right?
was an inside job.
Right. So,
Dogs are gay.
he took the banner, and he was the main hero, if you will, for getting that out into the public consciousness. But that was all by design, because obviously they wanted a character who looked like a nutter and said crazy things and acted crazy. And of course, fast forward many years later to him getting sued and speaking a lot of truths, actually, that were categorically put out in the public sphere to be shown as crazy talk and forbidden thoughts. um they're always putting these characters out there for us to latch on and be easy to find, but it just makes the counter argument to whatever the popular narrative is look crazy by design.
Right. But well, credit to where it's due. It was finding back in the day before InfoWars replaced Prison Planet. It was prisonplanet.com, then prisonplanet.tv. That's where I first came across anybody really questioning the events. And I was in a much different time zone from America and staying up really late at night to watch some videos. And then I got like, I ordered the DVD version of Terror Storm and things. So uh, I think that's kind of like the training wheels. What's really intriguing to me is where people end up. Do they stay in the Alex Jones, that little silo, and get into the? I think what he's encouraging is the whole paranoia. You know, we went to Bohemian. I almost said Bohemian Grove. Uh, I think even before 9/11, right? So he breaks in there. Interesting how he breaks in and gets access to that and gets out unscathed, never arrested for trespassing, whatever. We're meant to see what he shows us with that. And then I think the end result is if you raise your awareness that 9/11 doesn't add up, but you stay in the Alex Jones sphere, you end up feeling the weight of the world. They're out to get us. And that's not a healthy mindset. And I fell into that for a few years. I was on my bike training 20 hours a week, running 12 hours a week, and listening. I would download the MP3s of Alex Jones and I'd be like fired up. You know, let's go get the globalist. And I wasn't really much fun at parties because I'd be like, did you know about the New World Order? You know, kind of like that. Not really sounding like Alex, but it took me a while to kind of get out of that. Like, this is not really healthy. This is eating me up inside. And it's not good to feel like there's an enemy and it's out to get you. And we get to 2020, it's the same kind of thing. Like these invisible particles are out to get you. Yeah. So getting back to where do you go from there? You become aware of this. It doesn't add up. You graduate from Alex Jones. Where does the mind, where does your perception, and where does your attention go from there?
Great point. And I've seen the full spectrum of people in the, let's call it truther community, where people do, in fact, I know some of these people personally get stuck in that Alex Jones world and, living in fear and buying all his prepper stuff and supplements. And it's sad, but you can't force somebody, like any learning process. It has to be self-discovery and a desire to learn and grow more in some way. So I've given up on trying to push people past where they are. It's like they've got their own path and they're responsible for that. So
But do you
that
find
being
resistance to the whole idea of 9/11 doesn't add up? I find I can just drop that anytime. I was at a PT appointment this morning and I mentioned I don't give our channel to people in my real life, but I said I'm live streaming. It's 9/11. We're doing a 9/11 live stream, and the PT is like, "Oh, that's yeah, cool topic, like good topic to talk about." Like total normie as far as I can tell.
Yeah,
So there's
I
no
feel
pushback
like
on it.
the truth eventually can't be denied, although the history books will say something different about what went down. But I feel like anyone who lived through it, yeah, I think at this point, I would guess that at least 60% of the population, if you said something like you did earlier this morning, that the facts don't add up and there was something else going on, I think most people probably would say, yeah, you're right. And how far they're willing to go in that investigation and the discussion is definitely variable and specific to the person. But it's sort of like saying that the moon landing was a hoax. I don't think there's that many people who look at it objectively and go, nah, no, all that happened. I don't feel like there's really that momentum for people to stand behind the moon landing. Certainly there are a handful of those people still around, but I feel like the consciousness has shifted to the point where you can't convince a large amount of people who lived through it. Now, younger people who didn't live through it and open their history book or ask ChatGPT or whatever will get a different version, and then they're back into the narrative. But I think for a lot of people who live through these major events, yeah, I think it's acceptable to say that. And I'd like to think that 20 or 30 years from now, people look back at 2020 and say, ah, yeah, what a farce. They got people to take these mysterious injections and act crazy and fight each other for no good reason. And we're not there yet, but I feel like even now, 5 years later, a lot of people look back at that and go, man, that was crazy. What were we all doing?
Yeah, it takes time. I mean, I think one thing I wanted to get into was if you arrived at an sorry about the noise outside. It sounds terrible to me. Okay. I think the
I'm not
dragon.
hearing it.
Okay, I'm hearing this. It sounds like a dragon flying by. But it's probably
Maybe we've just put too much wrong think out there already. They're coming for you.
you're coming to take me away. So where were we?
Ironically, I hear a helicopter above our house.
Maybe it's black.
Yeah. No cows are
where
safe
was
in
I
the
going?
area.
Yeah, so I think what it's if you come to any kind of questioning, even if you're, you know, fast forwarding to recently, even if you're looking for to use horse paste, you're there's a progression that you're out of the mainstream, and we know there are so many traps, but you're out of the accepted or mainstream narrative, and you're searching a little bit. So that's that foundation of you belonging to, you're glued into this mainstream, almost like you belong to that team or that cell. It's shaken up, it's loosened. And whether or not, okay, so going back to 9/11, if you, even if you believe, it doesn't really matter what you believe. If you believe that it was an inside job, it was an inside outside job, as long as you don't believe the 19 hijackers, 3 planes, Shanksville, 2 buildings in New York, 3 buildings collapse, uh, impossible Pentagon maneuver, blah, blah, blah. If you question that at all, you probably weren't so likely to accept what was handed to us in the beginning of 2020. And so there is a progression of consciousness when you question things. And of course, you can always go a little too far. And I think we're almost getting to the point of demoralization, and that's what is the highest in my consciousness right now. Is like, do I freaking believe anything anymore? And that's not a good feeling. It's a little better than feeling like they're out to get us all the time. And but I do want to believe in something other than just, okay, I believe in God, uh, and I do need to feel a little purpose in the world. But we are at the point with AI and distrust in anything government does, anything official, anything mainstream and profitable and tied up with industry, that it's demoralizing. We're at a point of demoralization, as Yuri Bezmenov pointed to. That's the first stage, really, in the complete controlled demolition of society.
Yeah, and not to beat a dead horse and create horse paste, but we did talk last week about the need for discernment when we're given anything, and obviously that was before what happened yesterday. And I really do think, as we were talking about AI, that some element or aspect of that I think has been around for a long time. Look no further than the copy and pasted stories about the old world buildings and what happened to them, right? And so I think much of our history can be questioned and should be questioned, and it just really is down to the individual discerning between different elements of fact and what actually makes sense and what supports the mainstream narrative that gets us in a certain mindset. So I don't think really anything is new in terms of having to look at history with a skeptical lens, and certainly the books were written in a certain way to promote a set of narratives. But I think it's up to the individual to look at all these things and say, what was the intended result? What were they trying to get us to think or support? And certainly World War II is an example of, if you start digging into that too deeply and asking questions, you can get deplatformed very quickly because there's one accepted version of it, and that's that. And
You can get jailed in certain countries.
it's true. It's true. But even then, there's a lot of things that don't make sense in that set of stories. So yeah, I feel like it's always been with us, but certainly with AI, it's getting a lot more advanced.
Right. And maybe we just have to be mindful of the whole idea that maybe that demoralization, that whole feeling of, and of course it's a certain subset. I think, well, maybe choose your poison when it comes to demoralization. I mean, I'm observing where I am. People are so demoralized just with Orange Man in office. So there's various levels, right, of all this kind of stuff. But when you become aware of it, then how do you respond to it? And that's a repeating theme in our conversations all the time. When how do you respond? Where do you pay your attention? And for me, it's getting to the point where I'm almost ready to just log off this whole world of narratives. And I had my wife mentioned something about a friend who's completely unplugged, and she'd never even heard of Charlie Kirk. And it to her, it doesn't matter whether Osama bin Laden was a game show host on Channel 4 or, you know, the world's worst terrorist. It's kind of similar. She just lives in her own world, and raising a family and everything involving more tangible things. And for me, I'm getting to that point where it's like, okay, I don't really want to live in this virtual simulation anymore. And that's why maybe it doesn't matter to me whether the things are real. I'm not trying to prove a point about anything. But what I'm interested in, and I posted this in my comments in the world, in the virtual world, is it'll be interesting to see how similar to what they did. They said 19 Arabs, Muslim extremists, Saudi money based in Afghanistan. They hate us for our freedoms. They hate Israel, blah, blah, blah. Similar. How does this Charlie Kirk situation play out? And who are they going to finger? I just going to Rumble a few minutes before we started. I don't actually think our Rumble stream is working, by the way, but just going there, the top talking heads, the top shows we're talking about suspect, picture of a suspect, picture apprehended, that kind of suspect apprehended. So how does this play out? That's a narrative, and we're going to see that because there are people that are traumatized. There's people that are out for blood. So we'll see. But I just don't want to play into any of this stuff, and I kind of want to unplug.
Yeah, well, I think and actually I was going to comment before you gave the example of the friend who's completely unplugged, and I thought that's the direction that many of us should take. Is do we actually pay attention? Do we pay our attention to what's going on in the world stage? If it really doesn't affect us, then do we need to care? Do we need to give it our energy? What we create in our own world, in our own existence, and what we do in our lives and the people that matter to us, that's real, right? Now, sometimes the Venn diagram circles cross where your world gets invaded by what's out there, but things like whatever happened yesterday, at least initially, it doesn't really matter in my life. I mean, not to say that if someone did die, that's not tragic. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that at the end of the day, is it going to change anything that I'm doing? No. And so I think that your friend who's unplugged is probably on the right track. And we just have to, again, discern what's important, what's really going to impact us, and what's just out there as a distraction. So that's really my take on all of this. And of course, as someone who loves to go down the rabbit holes and understand what really happened, of course, then there's that aspect and looking at all the different evidences of what didn't happen on 9/11. But at the end of the day, yeah, there's some things that we can't engage in anymore. Like I said, I remember walking into airports freely with bottles of water or whatever. Actually, I don't even think bottled water existed then, but you get my point. You could have your soda with you, and it wasn't a thing. So yeah, I think that it's really just a matter of how much do we want to engage in all this.
Exactly. We've gotten to the point where, at least for us, I don't think it's more of a, we're more aloof about it and going, and it sounds crass sometimes if you want to just look at things from a higher view, higher perspective of things, and just kind of pull out and say, there's a lot of drama, there's a lot of theater. People are so invested in a particular aspect of the theater, or they're attached to a certain actor or a role. But it's, I think both of us we've gotten to the point where we recognize that everyone that is given to us is playing sort of role. And getting to my assertion, I don't know if it really matters if they're acting out a drama. I think on a spiritual level and ritualistic level, like, these people are tapping into some energies and they're playing out maybe ancient dramas in different ways. And it's almost like a wheel. So the cycle repeats, but they're covering different ground every time, right? So it rotates, the cycle comes back, like they're pulling the same crap, but it's not exactly the same time, the same thing every time.
Yeah, and that goes back to the earlier part of the discussion that you can recognize patterns in these world events and you'll see them played out in different ways. And then when they see that they succeeded, they double down on it on the next big event for sure. But I'm also conscious that we're getting close to the hour mark here, and I feel like we've covered a lot of what we wanted to talk about today. Just maybe a
We don't
temperature
have to
check.
stay. We don't have to stick to an hour.
But a temperature check for the people who are
Yeah.
streaming with us. Just
Hey,
curious,
well,
is there anything that people want to hear us talk about, or any topics to cover, or does this feel like a pretty wrapped up conversation? Someone throw a comment in the chat. We'd love to see it.
yeah. If you're not just left to your own devices and doing the dishes or something like that, just putting us, just to be nice, like putting us on the background. If you're actually near some kind of device where you can make a comment, please do. But I thought it would be important to cover. So, why does it matter in 2025 that 9/11? It's next year will be 25 years, a quarter freaking century. How many people do you know in your life? I mean, we're probably double the age as somebody that was born in, we're at least double the age as somebody that was born in 2001. But 9/11 for people 24, 25 years, and maybe a lot of people don't remember what happened before they were like 5 or 6. They don't become conscious of anything outside their family and visiting relatives and going to the amusement park or maybe even a ball game. They so their consciousness probably goes back to like even 30-year-olds. these days are not affected by 9/11, except maybe just a story. Well, I think back to my life. Wow. I mean, going back 30 years before I was born, that gets back to what we were talking about, the things, World War II. And I mean, that it seemed like a really long, far, a land far, far away when I was growing up, like World War II. Oh yeah, that's back then. So why should people who weren't directly affected by 9/11 give a damn these days? Or why does it matter and how does it affect them? I'll throw that question out to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot of this ground already, but I would say that people who either weren't born yet or too young to remember what happened, certainly they're living through the consequences every time they go through the airport, right? Like that whole apparatus of the TSA didn't exist before 9/11. And so in some way they're impacted, but you're right, it's just a story they were told growing up in grade school about what happened, and they accept it and move on. um, but maybe it's our job to remind people of what life used to be like before then, because we do remember, and we do remember the freedoms that were slowly taken away, or the invasion of privacy that's now standard because, well, we don't want to encourage terrorists, we don't want to be unsafe now, do we? So I think those are the real impacts. And then, as we talked about before, it's, well, they pulled that off. They pulled the moon landing off. They pulled off multiple world wars for questionable reasons. They pulled off 2020. What's next? And are we able to see that next act and see it for what it is? And can we help others see that?
Yeah, really good points. It's just an endless succession. Maybe as I was listening to you speak there, I was just thinking, well, yeah, maybe it's important to us because we lived through that period. But for somebody that wasn't directly affected by it, it's just another false flag in a way. It's just another rung in a progressive ladder towards something. And like just wrapped up with your remarks, where's it headed? Not really sure, but yeah, like Brady just said, it was definitely the birth of the surveillance state. It was even just this whole emphasis on safety, right? You got to be safe, and that fed into 2020 as well. And now we're seeing. I don't think I've completed the point of, because I was mentioning Satan Yahoo and the uh, surveillance state headed by the shitty little country. Um, in response to this Charlie Kirk situation, I saw a video of a guy who was associated with Unit 8200. I think he's like an American that from Brooklyn or something, but he's named Cohen, and he was on Fox News, and he was talking basically about pre-crime and this surveillance kind of, I would say, all-encompassing panopticon to detect erroneous activity before it occurs. And the host said, would it have been able to prevent the train attack on the Ukrainian last, or would it have been able to detect and prevent what happened in, or didn't happen in Utah? And he said, oh, absolutely. And he's selling this thing, and it's called Gideon. So you can look that up. So Brady, yeah, good point. Birth of the surveillance state and our acclimation to this whole thing. Like we're just, oh yeah, well I have nothing to hide. I mean, just talk to some people that have grown up since that time as well. They've grown up with the internet. They've grown up being exhibitionists, showing their lives, and so how are they going to take our notions of, well, there's a line to be drawn with privacy. They're like, I have nothing to hide. Why would I care about privacy? And it's good in the ex post facto to have to have a bunch of surveillance cameras at an intersection to see who smashed into whom, that kind of thing. It's like, yeah, it's good there's cameras everywhere. Or who reached into the cash register and stole something and ran off. Isn't that good to have surveillance everywhere? So we're fighting an uphill battle when it comes to privacy, for sure.
Yeah, and you raised a really good point there, and thanks Brady for chiming in, because it's getting us in a really important direction here, which is thought crime, right? I mean, surveillance ultimately leads to this idea that now we need preventative measures to stop the next big event, because we all saw what happened on TV and we don't want that to happen. So it goes a step beyond just monitoring what people are saying in chats or online or what videos are posting. It's like, well, it's like that Minority Report movie, right? It's the pre-crime, and that discussion has definitely been pushed over the past several years. I've seen many different talking heads advocating it, and I've seen, as you mentioned, this guy who's on Fox News and all the other similar channels pushing this idea that we need this, we need to stop the next big event. And that's just, one more application of the surveillance state that started at 9/11, and they're going to keep pushing until people say no. And if people don't say no, they'll just keep, give them an inch, they'll take a mile. 100%.
I think when there's an obsession with security, it's important to remind ourselves that we're all going to die. There's no ultimate security. And so maybe we should be a little more daring in our everyday lives and in our actions. Just maybe not hold back so much. And I'm not saying when the speed limit's 65 to go 165 and do reckless things in your life, but don't, for the sake of security or like the comfort zone that we were talking about before, don't make that stop you from doing stuff, from acting in your life. And that's the point we are, where I think a lot of the younger people these days didn't grow up playing in the yard. They grew up playing. First it was Game Boy, and then it was PlayStation, and then it was even like maybe you did a little bit. What's that thing that where you do like the fake tennis on the screen and that sort of stuff. And now it's just like there's not even any physical activity involved, and now there's like they're selling virtual pandas. Have you seen those on YouTube? Like I'm
I
getting
haven't, but
advertisements.
it totally doesn't surprise me that something like that exists. And
Yeah, you can
yeah,
have
I just,
little toys in your lap that are AI toys, and then there's
wow.
going to be AI boyfriend girlfriend, and we're at to that Joaquin Phoenix movie, Her, right?
Mm-hmm. Crazy. Yeah, there's no end of distractions, or just time sucks for people. But I really agree with what you said just a little bit ago, that life is for the living, and no one's guaranteed tomorrow. So live your life to the fullest. And it makes me think about a talk I heard earlier this year from someone who's doing very well in insurance, and that person gave the example of someone who, maybe when they take a trip somewhere on another side of the world, and they rent a car and they say no to the insurance, but they're very careful about everything, and living in fear of getting a ding and having to deal with that, versus someone who takes all the insurance and then lives no holds barred, right? And the similar analogy could be made for having life insurance. Plug, for those who know me will know why I'm saying that. But just having a solid plan in what you want to accomplish in life and going after it, versus waiting to that someday that may never happen.
Right, and even as far as waiting for that someday that never happens, waiting for that next shoe to drop that may never happen, or getting back to like the conspiracy minded people paying attention, the Fox News listeners, watchers, the MSLSD watchers, and the CNN watchers, whatever category or whatever little silo you're in, people are anticipating something, and that puts them on their heels and prevents them from going out and living because they're just waiting for something to happen. And again, that I think on a different scale as well, like waiting for somebody to come along and save them or to solve a perceived problem that might not even be a problem, like, the global warming climate change thing, which is not even a real problem. But there are those that base their entire life around that whole paradigm, and they're clamoring for a solution to something that doesn't even exist. Maybe we should do a show or two on that one of these days. But there's an agenda afoot, and that plays into it. And we know that is like Sustainable Development 20 Agenda 2030 and smart 15-minute cities. I saw a sign the other day that said, "We are a smart city, smart corridor." Yeah, actually driving around yesterday, and so there's always an agenda afoot. There's always something, and there's something about people giving their consent when it comes to it, just lending their consciousness. And I don't know what the percentage is. Maybe it's like a 1585 type thing. Like if more than 15% of the population knows it's a joke, it's a hoax, we're being played. I'm just making that 15% up, but it kind of feels that way. But if a certain percent of the population doesn't play along, they either have to stop or try a new game. But if it becomes, and this is speculation, but if the majority doesn't play along, then the majority can have the upper hand. And we haven't seen that in modern civilization. So maybe we'll get to that point if consciousness is raised. And I think that's my objective. I'm not telling people how it is. You're not telling people how it is. We're raising questions. We're having discussions. And I think our overall objective is to just ask questions and get people to try and elevate their consciousness.
Yeah, really good point. And it makes me think of the Pareto 80-20 rule or 20-80 rule. And I do wonder if 20% of people who resist in some way is enough to topple agendas. And certainly we've seen a number of trial balloons put out there where there was like, I remember monkeypox. Remember that from years ago? And it was like, people are like, nah, not
Nobody
buying
bought
it.
it. Yeah.
Nope, nobody bought it. And so it just quietly went away. And we do see those where they're just like, what's the pulse of the population? What are they going to bite onto? So yeah, and I think that even with the events that happened in 2020, there was people just kind of were like, enough is enough. And they had to, quietly pack the tents and wait for the next event that's planned. By I'd say 2022, people are just like, enough of this crap, right? Let's just get back to normal. But many of the objectives had been achieved, and the powers that be were happy to let things go back to normal until whatever the next act is.
Right. But the damage had already been done is in terms of acclimating people to certain behaviors, or even things like not going into the office, and actually requesting to work from home or doing remote work. It further drove people online. It destroyed a lot of small and medium-sized businesses. So there was a lot of damage that was done, and at the same time, they've used the prophylaxis of, oh well, this is a new normal. We're never going back to normal, and so we were supposed to accept that as well. Yeah, but good points on that.
Yeah, and I thought about this the other day, and I don't know what got me on this train of thought, but there never has been an official declaration that it's over. There was never, the mainstream channels never said, let's have a big mask burning party, let's throw a bunch of masks in a big pile in Times Square and light them on fire and say it's over. And I've brought up this point before, talking about long ranging impacts of these world events. When you pass through, I believe it's LaGuardia, newly renovated, I'll never forget 2 or 3 years ago passing through there and seeing the permanently etched masks required thing on one of the sliding glass doors, like that wasn't a temporary piece of paper. That is permanently on that door. So the threat always exists that they could cook up some other version of this and rerun the play. But I think they'd need to wait a while because there definitely was some exhaustion in the public related to all the malarkey of 2020.
Kind of like an elastic band. It was going to break at some point, and then it's eased and relaxed, and something else is cooked up. And if we keep paying our attention and limiting our conduct to that sphere where things like what they were pulling off affected us, then we'll fall, we'll be impacted by the next one inevitably.
Yeah. So where do we take things from here? I guess the next step is just beyond just the knowledge, as you like to say, what are we going to do about it? Right. So what
Yeah.
are your thoughts in maybe wrapping up this conversation? I don't think we need to beat the dead horse of all the different details of 9/11 that exists everywhere. But now that
Right.
we've had this discussion, what's the next step here?
As far as our 9/11 goes, or well, the
Yeah,
next step is
that was
quarter
an
century mark.
yeah. I mean, but
We'll be back
where
next year for another live stream with a free trial of the streaming software because it's
well, for
bloody
sure, and
expensive.
we're gonna have to provide a new angle when we revisit 9/11 next year. But what do we do with this knowledge?
Yeah.
What do we as a community do to improve that 20 versus 80 ratio?
What I think one thing that we've touched on a few times, but is worth reiterating, is don't necessarily fall into following somebody on some kind of a platform that appears and gives you narrative, um, maybe a McCullough, right? When it comes to that, David Ray Griffin, may he rest in peace. I believe he's expired. AJ, anybody. So just beware of what you're handed as far as stories, narratives, actors, players, and how you respond to it. And just remember that you're looking, unless you are experiencing this in your own life, you're experiencing it indirectly, and it's perceived most likely through a rectangular device. And we cannot gauge its authenticity through that device. And now, with, like we've already mentioned, with AI, all bets are off. But don't let it demoralize you. And I like, actually, Medicine Girl had a like kind of an emergency video that she posted yesterday. Of course, this is going to be archived, so it was 9, 10, 25. And she was talking about Substack basically throttling the view count, things like that. But she ended up just with an appeal to pay attention to people in your life and give them a hug, and just the basic stuff. And it sounds kind of wishy-washy and wimpy or something like that, but it's not, for me, it's not like we got to go get somebody and take action and let's get this civil war going, or get them there before they get us, or anything like that. It's like, how can you find unity in your own life and coherence and meaning? It's simple, profound, but it's simple.
Well said. And I don't really have anything to add to that, to be honest. I think that maybe this would be a great time for a last call for whoever's still hanging around with us. Anything else you want to chime in there? Otherwise, I think we've had a successful live stream here. We've made hay on the dubious anniversary of 9/11, and definitely incentive for us to do this again next year and have y'all with us.
Yeah, with dozens and maybe hundreds of more people next
We can
year.
only hope.
I hope so. But I actually like, we intended a little bit to get into some of the nitty gritty and maybe some mechanics, or kind of debunking narratives. But looking back, that we've had this conversation for for 80 minutes already. I kind of like that we didn't get into that. It's and that's of a piece. It's coherent with what we've been doing. We're having conversations about the meaning of these things rather than like trying to piece together. It's kind of like a whodunit. And you have all those true crime shows, and people get caught up in the drama of it, and it's just the same kind of experience as watching TV. And we want to encourage people to just be authentic, not fall further into true crime dramas.
Here, here.
Right.
All right. Well, this has been awesome. Been a good experience. I hope everyone who's been streaming with us has enjoyed it. And for those of you who watch the recording later, thank you for making it this far. We generally try to keep things capped at an hour, but I think we had a really fruitful discussion. So I'd say stay tuned for next week and beyond.
Here, here. This is a wrap for. It'll be episode 36 and archived. And thank you for tuning in, whether you were here with us live or you're seeing this at another time. And we'll see you back next year on 9/11. And I'm sure a lot will happen between now and then.
Yeah, who knows? Thanks, everyone.
Take care.